Our next speaker is DAMON. He is a professor of communications, sociology, and engineering at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is the director of the Network Dynamics Group. He's a leading world expert on social networks and behavior change, and today he will talk about creating change. With that said, we have 50 copies of Damon's book, Change: How to Make Big Things Happen, to raffle on Thursday, so stay tuned. Damon, stage is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to talk to you today about how people change and how institutions change. And the way I want to start this is by asking you just sort of a basic question about individuals and collectives. So when you look at people adopting a new technology, we tend to think of people as individuals, much like these fish interacting in a large social population. One thing to think about is if you were to try to study these fish one at a time, could you ever figure out what they would do when you put them all together in this large group? And what you see when they're in a group is this magnificent, complex collective pattern of behavior. It would be very hard to predict if you just study these fish one at a time. And so my view is that in order to understand society and social change and really the institutions that people form, you have to study how people interact together and what the forces are that create the collective coherence or that can undermine it and disband collective coherence. And today, the way we tend to think about this is in terms of networks. What binds people together are the patterns of connection between them and the people they know and the people they know and so forth. And when we look at networks, there are several key features that we think are the most important things for understanding human behavior and human behavior change. And typically, we pick out the people who have very highly connected networks, who are in the center of the network, and they've got ties reaching out in all directions. And then we look at people who are in the periphery of the network, shown on the right, who have many fewer connections, but also those connections are sort of clustered together. So it's not just the number of connections that differs between the center and the periphery, but also the structure of those connections that's different. And when we think about any kind of technology diffusion process or innovation process, we have a kind of common idea of how it works. We say, well, typically someone who's highly connected adopts first, and that person influences the people around them. And from that initial process, then it spreads very effectively out towards the outer skirts of the network and then saturates the rest of the population. So that's our classic model of spreading. What I want to suggest is that a problem has arisen in the last 20 years. We've started to get really good data on how social movements spread, how new technologies like Twitter and Facebook spread. And really what we tend to see is that when technology or new ideas, new political movements take hold, they tend to take hold out in the periphery instead of the center. And then when they spread, instead of jumping to the center, what they tend to do is they tend to spread around the edges of the social network. And they only reach the center of the network at the very end of the process. So now you've got a very deep scientific problem that actually means something for every industry that works in technology and behavior change, which is that our old model on the left, that things spread from the center outward, is in total contradiction with all of our best data on the right, which shows that new ideas, innovations tend to spread from the outside in. So how do we solve this problem? What's going on here fundamentally is about how networks work and our intuitions. When we look at the network on the left, a highly connected person located in the center of the population, it just looks like us, looks like a fast network. We see one person with lots of connections and we say, if this was, we had to make a choice about who to target to spread our idea or to influence the population, we would target that person at the center of that cluster or that fireworks explosion because they have lots of ties going in all directions. But what about the network on the right? Well, what I want to talk to you about today is that the network on the left is really good for spreading diseases. And many of our ideas come from that. But the network on the right is actually the better network for spreading social change, new technologies, and new ideas. And the reason for this is that almost all of our thinking about networks and about behavior change is based on epidemiology. It's based on the science of disease spreading. And so when we think about the spread of something like COVID-19 or the spread of measles, we have a very clear intuition. We think, well, if someone gets sick and they come into a contact with a lot of people, then all those people get sick too. And again, that works well for describing disease spreading. But when it comes to social change or changing the way people think, we have to also take into account the social context in which people interact, political boundaries, social groups, social identity, and the way that those things interact with peer feedback and the dynamics of personal change interacting with the people around you. And that process is much more complex than the way diseases spread. And so I'm going to talk today about viral spreading and why it fails us when we try to understand human behavior. And then I'm going to focus on like the biggest concept for today, the main concept that's in the book and the main concept of this talk, which is the difference between a simple contagion, which is what we've talked about historically, like diseases, and complex contagions, which is what we really care about when we think about social behavior change and institutional change. What this does is reveal several myths of diffusion, and I'll show you how once we understand this new theory of behavior change, it allows us to understand how to trigger tipping points in social behavior in institutions and in communities at large. Fundamentally, one of the big ideas in the last couple of decades has been nudges. And I want to show you that nudges is actually a very small concept that just applies to one individual at a time. And what we should really be thinking about are norms, which is just like those schooling fish. Instead of thinking about how one fish might change its behavior, we want to think about how whole schools of fish behave and how we can change everyone at once. So briefly, I'll give you an overview of contagiousness. I'll talk about the myth of virality, the myth of stickiness, and the myth of the influencer. And then I'll talk about how to trigger tipping points. So contagiousness, we can think about it in a very basic way. You can say, well, what is the difference between something like a social norm, which is the kind of thing we want to change, and something that we're familiar with, like a viral video, or in many cases, COVID-19. Say, well, for something like a disease or a viral video, if one person has it, they come into contact with somebody else, and it's very easy to spread it. There's no reason why the person, shouldn't get sick or shouldn't check out the viral video, and then spread it to the other people they know. And then from there, it spreads throughout the network from person to person. Now, this is our classic model of spreading, which is that every link in the social network is equivalent to a transmission. Now, again, this works really well for diseases, for gossip, for viral videos, but there's some very important assumptions here. One is that every time there's a contact, there's a transmission. And we know, of course, that's not true. Right? We know that in certain cases with behavior, the opposite happens. When you come into contact with someone who's doing it, you actually become less likely to do it, particularly if that person belongs to a different political party or has differences from you that make that behavior less salient as a result of that interaction. Also, we assume that there's no resistance, and the thing that's spreading is easy, familiar, low cost, whatever contact equals adoption. But now imagine that the person who has adopted is wearing a face mask. But all the other people shown in gray surrounding that center person are not wearing face masks. Now, because those people aren't wearing a face mask, they exert a kind of countervailing influence on the central person, where the central person is aware there's a norm in their community, and this person wearing a face mask is violating the community's norm. So the non-adopters don't really have to do anything. They just have to sit there and not adopt, and they put pressure that prevents the center person from adopting. And so even a second person can adopt, and there's still enough pressure from the non-adopters to prevent the person from adopting. Finally, a third person may adopt, and then ultimately the center person may think, okay, this is legitimate enough, this is credible enough that I'll adopt it too. And this is the process of complex contagion. And so unlike simple contagion, like the virus, complex contagion relies fundamentally on the relationship between the adopters and the non-adopters and feelings of legitimacy and credibility. And so, of course, it's always the case that people require multiple contacts, but more important than that, they have to feel like the resistance to change is overcome. And this is the truth whenever we uncover difficult or unfamiliar or costly behaviors, whether they're technologies or changes in health behavior or unfamiliar ideas. And so what happens is once we appreciate the difference between a simple contagion and a complex contagion, it kind of pulls from our eyes some of the classic myths that we've always believed in. One is the myth of virality, which is that everything spreads like a virus. The second one is the myth of stickiness, which is that, all you have to do is design the perfect product with all the right features and everyone will want to use it. And the third, of course, is the myth of the influencer, which is all you have to do is find that right one person and they'll spread your idea to everyone. So let me disabuse you of some of these myths and show you when these myths go away, what is left is a new theory of how to institute change and how effective it can be. So the myth of virality really starts with this idea that if we can just introduce something into a population, it should spread all by itself. In the 1960s, lots of different countries were trying to introduce contraception, which is a difficult sell. These were countries that were largely agrarian. Families routinely had 5 to 6 children, and that was because there was high infant mortality. So there were large cultural and social norms built around having, large families and having very successful um, children, and then having your children be successful at having lots of children and so forth. And that was considered to be a mark of honor. So in the 1960s, lots of these countries were going through the demographic transition. There was an influx of vaccination, of health and sanitation, of industrialization, right? All of a sudden, kids were living longer, and infant mortality just dropped off precipitously, which meant that if families were having 5 to 6 kids, all those kids would survive. And then all those kids would have 5 to 6 kids. So if you do the math, within 2 generations, you're going to have massive overpopulation, starvation, disease. It's extremely dangerous. So these countries, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Korea, among others, tried to institute these massive contraception efforts to, change the way everyone was thinking. And you can think of this in some ways as like a technology campaign. Like they were trying to get everyone to adopt a new technology that was, unfamiliar and that was going to change their lives, but was, ultimately for the good. The problem, of course, is that they were going up against long-standing cultural norms. And so lots of countries tried the standard thing that you would try, which is they tried like advertising campaigns, mass media marketing. They tried to shame people into having fewer kids. It's bad to have too many kids. And all these countries struggled with fertility rates for decades. And the exception is Korea, and this is what we're going to focus on, because Korea, within 20 years of starting its contraception campaign, reached all of its policy goals. So that's remarkable. You can put on any national scale to change the entire culture of a country in 20 years is an impressive feat, let alone for something as entrenched and difficult to address as family planning practices. If you compare that to the US, like for example, the US has a war on drugs that's been running since the 1970s. And in 2015, Congress finally admitted that almost after 50 years, basically nothing had happened. And if anything, the problem had gotten worse, right? So it's very, very hard to institute large scale change in such a short period of time. So what did Korea do that was so effective? That's what we want to understand and hopefully glean some lessons from. And what they did was they focused on social norms. So essentially, there are 3 kinds of networks or 3 kinds of village structures that they saw. One was that people were tightly clustered into these tight-knit village communities with, let's say, a single tie or a single broker person who would go back and forth between one part of the community or village and another part. And what happens if you got a couple of early adopters of contraception within one cluster, they could convince each other to participate in this idea, and then it would take hold within that community. But what would wind up happening is that it wouldn't spread across this sort of single weak tie. Now, the reason is because this is a complex contagion that requires social reinforcement. Now, over here in the urban network, there was not enough social reinforcement at all to even get the innovation started. It would just sort of be a non-starter in that community. But then they discovered these villages that had this structure that wound up being one of the major discoveries of research during this era, which is that they had these kinds of clusters in the community that could create reinforcement for this innovation. Then they also had wide overlapping bridges that could allow the innovation to kind of spill over to other communities. And then when people adopted it, it would spill over. And what's interesting is here, the spreading process wasn't like a viral spreading. It didn't spread everywhere in all directions at once. It just spread from part of the community to other part of the community in this very organic way, but it was incredibly effective at saturating the entire population. What's so interesting is that lesson from Korea translates directly into thinking about organizations and organizational change. Because organizations, by and large, are structured in a way, so you've got different groups, different divisions, whether it's the engineering division and the sales division or different divisions in terms of their regional location. And they're often siloed. They don't have a ton of communication back and forth. So group A doesn't really talk to group B or group B to group C. And so one of the major solutions that scientists came up with was to say, well, you should have someone who takes on the role of a broker. And the idea was that this person, Robert, could show up in an organization and start making ties over to different groups. He could make a tie to Elizabeth in group A and Emily in group B. And Robert, all of a sudden, would be kind of the person or the conduit through which all the information spread across an organization. So he would perform this tremendous service for the organization by letting information spread across all these different groups. In doing so, Robert would gain a lot of power, right? He'd get known as the guy who was the broker for the organization. So more people would come to him and he'd get more ties. And he'd have this sort of spanning set of networks that reached across the organization, very much like the fireworks network I showed you at the beginning with the influencer. So this is kind of business management, how to get ahead with networks 101. It's a very easy way for Robert to gain status and prestige and power in the organization while also helping the organization. But here's the thing. Information transfer is not the same thing as knowledge transfer. While Robert and his networks are very good at spreading information, gossip, new ideas from parts of the information to other parts, they're not very good at getting one group in the organization to start taking up the innovations that are started by another group. So if group A, let's say they're adopted a new management practice that's difficult to use, but once they got a hold of it, it actually allowed them to be much more productive. And Elizabeth tells Robert about it, and Robert tries to convince the people in Group B. Well, the people in Group B haven't seen this, and the only person they've heard about it from is Robert. Now, they trust Robert and they like Robert, but they also know that Robert's main advantage in the organization is that he's known as a broker, as someone who spreads information. So they're a little skeptical about this new management practice because they know that Robert gains a certain amount of social status because he's able to spread these things. So what they want is like a more honest take or a more neutral take on this technology and whether it works. Now imagine the networks now look like this. Now there's wide bridges, multiple reinforcing ties between Group A and Group B. So now the people in Group B can observe the people in Group A working with each other with this new technology. And they can also talk to each other about what they are seeing, whether they agree that it's working well, whether that technology and the way it works for people in Group A would also work for them in the same way for Group B, right? And they can start to come to consensus about whether or not they do want to adopt it. And if they do, then they can coordinate, much like we saw in the Korean contraception case. They can coordinate on adopting it and then spread it through their group. And what's interesting about this is Robert has less power than he did before, right? Robert would prefer that the bridges were narrow because he controls them. Now that the bridge is wide, there's all kinds of overlapping influences. But this is good for the organization because it means that reinforcing ideas and new innovations can spread effectively between groups. It also means that if Robert leaves the organization, the networks don't disappear, right? Because one thing that makes Robert powerful is that when he's the only broker, he controls all those networks. And if he threatens to leave, he actually has a lot of value, right? Because he's the exclusive holder of those networks. So that makes those networks kind of fragile. But if you have a wide bridge, now Robert can leave the organization and you still have a structure that can support innovation exchange between different parts of the organization. So this structure of wide bridges turns out to be one of the sort of more important concepts for thinking about how to structure an organization effectively to make it adaptive and innovative. Now, it turns out that it's not just within an organization, but within industries. So if you think now about the connections between different firms in Silicon Valley or different research teams working on the Human Genome Project, or different schools and universities and departments working on the field of network science, these lessons are all the same. In every case, the success of these initiatives have come because organizational boundaries that used to be very, very strict and kept kind of people siloed, the same way that, in Silicon Valley, different firms initially had very high boundaries. Like IBM wouldn't let people from other firms come in and talk to their engineers about projects. There was project secrecy, there was intellectual property, all these reasons to keep boundaries. All of a sudden, Silicon Valley, copying really this Japanese model, started letting people from competing firms come into their firm and work on teams together. And it would allow them to be much more innovative because they could sort of harness the ideas from both teams, but they weren't just spreading information. They were actually changing the way they were doing business as a result of these sort of co-teams, these wide bridges across the organizations. And this is one of the key things that allowed Silicon Valley to be so productive so fast. And it's also part of what people know now as the Open Software Initiative. It's been growing in this same way with allowing networks to form across organizational boundaries. Interestingly, it's also the same structure that allowed Black Lives Matter to take hold so effectively and to spread from all different parts of the country, from Ferguson, Missouri, all the way across the US, and then ultimately all the way across the world. And it's one of those things that no one really saw coming, but it's a direct function of the structure of the social media networks that formed around those original events in Ferguson in 2014. So this gives us kind of a big picture lesson about how networks operate, both within organizations for the purpose of designing efficient and effective and adaptive technology diffusion, and also within citizens and large populations for growing effective social change networks. And the main shift in thinking is from individual brokers and simple contagions to wide bridges between groups and complex contagions. So one of the new questions that comes up then is to say, okay, well, let's imagine you've got a structure that's our ideal structure. It's going to work perfectly. How do I, as an organization, or I, as an innovator, target that structure? How do I intervene to sort of seed my new idea very effectively? Well, if you look at these red nodes, if you thought, well, what I want to do ultimately is get as much exposure as possible for my idea, and each red node is a change agent. So wouldn't I locate my change agents as widely distributed as possible? And that would get maximum exposure. That's simple contagion thinking. And yes, if you're talking about spreading COVID, this will be a very effective way to sort of seed COVID in the population. But what if you're talking about spreading face masks? Well, now each person is surrounded by people who aren't wearing face masks. So not only are they not going to be very effective at convincing everyone around them to change their social norms, ultimately, if you wait long enough, these people will give up on the social norm and go back to doing what everyone else is doing. So here's an idea, which is to use the theory of complex contagion to take the same population with the same level of resistance in the same network, and now initiate change just by changing your strategy of where to put your change makers. Here I've put all the change makers together in one cluster. Now from the classic model, the viral model of diffusion, this seems crazy because basically it's like having a bunch of telemarketers call each other. What's the point? They all know they're trying to spread the product. But in this case, each of the change agents is able to talk to the other change agents and give each other support and confidence that they're doing the right thing and that this is going to work. And then they can coordinate together and talk to other people and provide reinforcing signals that this is a good idea. And then what happens is they start to get some amount of takeoff, some purchase within the small group where they started. But then once this group winds up converging, then it spreads to the nearby group and then to the nearby group. And you can see, just like what happened in Korea, you can see this very effective change process taking hold within an organization and then spreading from each of the divisions within an organization across the entire population. So this means that this way of thinking about wide bridges doesn't just tell us what the structure of an organization is. It really tells us how to target organizations and target populations at large. So one of the main lessons that came out of Korea was that it wasn't just that they were very effective at spreading contraception. It was that each of the villages became sort of coherent or converged on a single method of contraception. That's what you'd expect. You'd say, okay, this village became an IUD village. And our classic thinking says, well, that's because the IUD is a better technology, right? Whatever technology is going to spread, it's going to be the stickier one. So we should expect that to spread everywhere. But that's not what happened. In one village, the IUD took off. Everyone adopted the IUD. But in the next village, the pill took off. Everyone adopted the pill. In the next village, the condom took off. Everyone adopted the condom. What this tells us is what's going on in these villages is a process of convergence on social norms, irrespective of the particular technology. So the answer to change isn't to make a perfect technology. The answer to change is to focus on how the social networks can create a norm. And this brings us to the myth of stickiness, which is the idea that if you just make the perfect product, your change problems will be solved. Now, of course, we know historically this is false. We've got, lots and lots of historical cases. The dustbins of economic history are littered with examples of better marketed, more effective, more efficient technologies that failed. And they had all of the things they're supposed to have. They were emotional, they had triggers, they were public, they were practical, all these kind of list of features we're supposed to give our product. But it turns out that the inferior product often wins over the superior one because it exploits networks better. And so the key here is exploiting the structure of the network. A really good example of this is a current example. Just prior to the pandemic, one of the major challenges in sub-Saharan Africa was getting people to adopt HIV medication. And the big breakthrough, the insight was that the things they were trying to do were too hard. Getting people to get circumcised, it just was a cultural profanity, or getting people to use condoms, it was too much of a burden. If they could just invent a sticky technology, a pill that was free and accessible, people could take it once a day, like a Tylenol, then if that could be effective, then that would solve the problem of HIV transmission in sub-Saharan Africa. So they did this. They invented this pill, and it was thought of as like a miracle drug. And then they deployed this massive program across 3 nations in sub-Saharan Africa to deploy to give people the pill for free and to show how effective it was at preventing HIV. And what they had was they had women coming every day to get the pill, every week to get the pill and then get a blood sample. And they were going to show how effective this was at preventing the infection rate from growing. And what they found was just the opposite. This is one of those major sort of historical backfire events. In fact, it was so egregiously a failure, such a fiasco, that the directors of the program wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, basically announcing what a colossal failure their project had been, which is a rare article to write at a high tier journal. But it was because there's so much faith in this model of giving people a sticky product. And what wound up happening was that the women would come in, they'd give their blood, they'd get the pill, they'd go home, and then they would throw it away, right? They wouldn't take it. And then that's mind-boggling because there's so much effort involved in being part of this process and this trial. Why would they go through all that and then not take the pill? And the reason was because there were lots of stigmas around HIV in their community. And some people thought that taking the pill might give you HIV. That sounds like an unusual thought, but actually in the US, lots of people think that getting a flu shot will give you the flu, right? There's lots of misinformation, or what we call today fake news, about health communication and about facts. So people had some misinformation about this pill, and that misinformation triggered social norms within the neighborhood communities, within these villages, within these nations, suggesting that if people were taking the preventative measure, they might actually be more susceptible to HIV, and then they'd be susceptible to the discrimination that comes from the way that people were treated once they had HIV. And so the social norms were much more influential at controlling people's behavior than any sticky product could be. And this is where we say, okay, we kind of throw our hands up in the air. We say the product doesn't work, virality doesn't work. What can we do? And then we all go and say, okay, let's get the influencer. If we can just get the influencer, we'll solve all of our problems. But that again is a myth. And the myth of the influencer brings us back to this sort of central idea I was showing you at the beginning, which is that there are some people who are highly connected, many people who are less connected. And of course, if you can find a highly connected person, then that person is able to detect new things, innovations in the population early on because they have so many network ties. So they detect something and then they adopt it and they spread it to everyone, right? And that's our model of why we want to find an influencer. And again, that's a really good model for how disease spreads, right? But what goes wrong with complex contagions? Well, what goes wrong with complex contagion is that if you're trying to convince a highly connected person, an influencer, to adopt something that goes against the norms that everyone else has, that violates people's sense of normal behavior or their sense of legitimacy or their sense of credibility, then what all of these ties that are going out that we think of as accelerating diffusion, these are actually also ties that are coming in. And what that means is that someone who's highly connected is also highly watched. They're being evaluated, they're being judged, they're being commented on. So if they do something that's unusual or goes against the norms, particularly in their industry, imagine this person is a highly connected CEO of a Fortune 500 firm. Well, their reputation is enormous. They really worry about how they're perceived in their professional community. So they can't just run around adopting any technology or any management practice without looking at how it's going to appear to their peers. Because if it goes wrong, they're going to be very embarrassed and maybe even lose their job. This is one reason why people who are highly connected tend to see if more and more people adopt, therefore it's more acceptable, therefore they'll adopt, right? So the question is, well, if these people have to wait, how do you get something off the ground in the first place to ever get some kind of critical mass? And this is where the network on the right comes in. Because these people are less connected, it only takes a few connections to create a sense of social influence. They have fewer countervailing influences. And also because they've got neighbors of neighbors and neighbors who are clustered together, it's easy to gain kind of a critical mass around a new idea that can then start to spread outward. Now, this has been true for decades, even since the 70s, this idea that like major institutional change comes from the periphery or comes from these less connected people has been studied. But the problem has been that we've had this theory of influencers, this theory of weak ties, and it's prevented us from really seeing how these things work. And so it's really just in the last decade, with all of the data from social media, we've been able to see really, really clearly just how important the periphery of the network is for influencing everybody else. And so this gives us, I think, a really important insight into tipping points. This is kind of where we're going to close the talk. I want to show you that if you have a network that looks like this, and you say, well, what if we could trigger a tipping point? And this is very much the idea of most of our brand marketing strategies. We say, well, maybe hard to convince the influencer. They may resist it, but if we could give them enough money, then they should be able to spread our product. You can say, well, look, if what you're spreading is like a new brand of coconut water, something trivial and easy, a simple contagion, sure. Then, give it to the influencer and they'll just spread it and it will explode virally across the network. And that's fine. But the problem is when you move to a complex contagion, it doesn't just fail. This strategy can backfire, and I mean really hurt your organization. And the famous case of this is Google Glass. It's something I talk about in the book, where I kind of walk through the story of, it made sense to Google to create this exciting, memorable, sticky product, this cyborg technology where you could, browse the web and record the visual field just with a pair of glasses. It seemed really cool. And then the idea was not only to make it sticky, but also to use the influencers to spread it. So they would target these elites in the Silicon Valley community and made it a very expensive technology, $1,500 on glasses. And the idea was that everyone was going to see these techie elites wearing this cool sticky product, and they were going to want it too, right? It was going to create aspiration. What happened was exactly the opposite. It was that using a set of eyeglasses to record the visual environment while you were talking to people was seen as a violation of privacy norms. Also, it was seen as just kind of rude to browse the web while you were in like a face-to-face conversation with someone. And in fact, the term glass hole was invented by regular citizens as a way of characterizing the influencers who were wearing this technology. And so you got this massive cultural backlash that turned the influencers from the people we're trying to imitate into the people that we didn't want around us, the people we were rejecting. And so the entire product line was shut down. But worse than that, the reputation of the company, Google, actually took a hit as a result of this product, right? So this is an example of enormous backfire. So now we have a way of thinking about this that can change this outcome, hopefully, and change our way of approaching social norms. If you try to influence a population where there's resistance to a new idea, the influencer may get one or two people around them, but ultimately those people are also surrounded by countervailing influences. There's just too much pressure pushing back. But if you take the same technology, the same population with the same level of resistance, and just change your targeting strategy, and now target this group out here, which seems like it has nothing to do with any part of the population that's relevant for change. But what you can do is identify that this cluster of people has lots of wide bridges around the periphery. And what you'll notice is very interesting is once this technology takes hold in the group, it starts to spread, but it doesn't just jump to the center right away. It starts to spread through these patterns of wide bridges along the structure of the network, and then it builds a critical mass. And once it gets a critical mass, then it comes through the center of the network and takes over the population. And this is really this new theory of change, how to target social norms to change populations as a whole. Implementation really means that the key concepts here are reinforcement, and the main things you're trying to do are achieve legitimacy and credibility. And wide bridges are the way to do that. Ultimately, you're also looking for relevant peers. It matters whether, if you're, from one political party or another, or from one social economic group or another. People are looking for people who are relevant to them when making these kinds of decisions. And finally, when you're looking at technology diffusion or product diffusion, you have to remember that you're also fundamentally looking at norm diffusion. You have to think about it from that perspective of social norms. So ultimately, I would say that I'm hoping that now that when you look at this, you'll see something new. You'll see these two networks, but you'll also see the network on the left, which initially looked like it was going to be fast for everything. You can see that and say, okay, that's going to be fast for a simple contagion. It's going to be fast for disease. But when it comes to a social norm or something that requires reinforcement or something where countervailing influences matter, the network on the right is actually going to be the place where it's going to take hold better. And this really changes our whole concept of spreading innovation, because now we have to appreciate the innovations are often unfamiliar. They require complementarity. We have to do them together. We require coordination. And ultimately, people are looking for these bridges that can help to sort of convey these ideas or innovations from group to group. And this also changes our thinking about nudges, because nudges are things we do one at a time. We give everyone a nudge. But if people are paying attention to each other, then an individual nudge isn't going to be that effective. We have to think about the way that norms operate in a community and how we can shift the norm. And in many ways, what we're doing is developing a new theory of critical mass, a new way of triggering tipping points for initiating large-scale change. So thank you very much, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much. This was a very enlightening talk, and I will surely have to watch it again to make sure I got all of the information out of it. Thank you very much. With that said, we have the first question here. Why do you think misinformation spreads so much more effectively than true facts in the same network? How can we utilize the spreading methods of fake news for spreading useful information?
Yeah, that's a great question. I addressed that topic toward the end of the book. The thing about misinformation is that it tends to be a simple contagion. Why is it a simple contagion? Because misinformation can say anything. All it has to do is be tailored to a norm or a bias or a set of beliefs that a community already, holds. So if I develop a fake news story or a piece of misinformation, and it's completely consistent with what you already believe. Now, it's not true, but oftentimes the truth is more challenging than fiction, because fiction can be a story that tells us what we already think, what we already like, tells us what we already want to believe. And so that's very easy to adopt and very easy to spread, because you're basically just telling people what they already think.
And confirmation bias.
It's confirmation bias, but confirmation bias usually also means that you're saying, well, I'm seeing something true and seeing something false, and I kind of select the false thing. But this is saying that the false thing actually just spreads faster. It's easier to repeat, it's easier to explain, it's easier to promote, because it makes sense to us, right? We understand it. It's a story that resonates. The true story is often kind of subtle and complicated and difficult to understand. And if we try to repeat it, we kind of feel like we don't quite know what we're talking about. And so it's actually harder to get that it's a complex contagion. We require kind of reinforcement from a couple of people to feel like we actually do know what we're talking about. This is what it means. And we need their help to be able to spread it. So a good example of this is like when the vaccine first came out for COVID-19. There were all of these, conspiracy theories, but the conspiracy theories resonated with people's existing beliefs. So in the US, there's this enormous historical tension with the African-American community and public health. And the reason for that tension is that the public health community has committed atrocities against the African-American community. Some of them about, they're famous, like these experiments where they gave black men syphilis just to see what would happen. But some of them are less well known about and more pernicious, like involuntary sterilization of black women. It's been going on for decades in the US, right? So you've got this really tortured and kind of lack of trust in the relationship between public health and the African-American community. So then COVID comes out, the COVID vaccine comes out, and now the African-American community is very susceptible, because of their fundamental mistrust of public health, to misinformation, to conspiracy theories about what's really going on and whether the vaccine is really safe, right? And so you say, okay, well, there's a history of mistrust, so it's understandable that you wouldn't take the news story, which is complicated and very specific, at face value. You're going to tell a more complex story that resonates with your cultural norms and resonates with the history of your culture that's a true history. Now, that's a very difficult challenge, because how do you get true news into a community that has good reason for resisting whatever the sort of medical authorities are saying? And the answer to that is basically networks. Is that what you want to do is to change the network so you don't have influencers spreading stories that are familiar to everyone. You want to sort of get into the corner of the network, the periphery, where you can sort of get some reinforcement for a story with some subtlety. Okay, the vaccine works, but it only works with people of a certain age. And it works, but only for a certain amount of time. So you have to get a second shot and you have to get a booster shot, right? These are nuances that are much harder to understand than some of the conspiracy theories, like 5G towers cause COVID, right? And it sounds crazy to say that, but that particular like fake news meme spread around the US. And there people were talking about it everywhere. 5G towers cause COVID. And it's easy to say, it's kind of fun to say because it seems like there's some underlying relationship between technology and disease, which is mysterious, but it sort of is consistent with some of the suspicions that a community may hold. And so what you see is kind of different fake news stories spreading through different communities because the stories were kind of tailored to those communities, whereas the truth is going to be the same for every community. So getting the truth to take hold in each community is a bigger challenge. But again, there are network strategies that can make that more effective.
Right. Thank you so much. I believe that was a really effective answer. The next question is, can you resolve this with Rogers/Moore's model of diffusion of innovation, especially with regard to disruptive technologies, or should we retire that model?
Yeah, we should retire that model. And if I can, if you'll forgive me stopping my screen share, I want to see if I have these slides here. All right, sorry. I don't think I do have them here. So there are several other slides that help to explain this process of change that specifically show why that model fails. I do have those slides. I think I'll show them to you. That explains why that process fails and how we can make it succeed. I'm going to turn my presentation back on in a second.
All right, we will share it with our audience.
Okay, so here we go. Okay, and then if I can go back to here and slide share. I apologize, it'll be worth it once these slides come up.
All right. Well,
the basic story is that what Rogers had talked about was basically there are sort of different types of people, and that if you could sort of identify the early adopters early on, that you could trigger a change process effectively. Here we go. You could trigger a change process effectively, and what I think is really wrong about that is that ultimately change isn't really about getting certain people to adopt. It's about getting certain parts of the social network to adopt. And so what you want to do is very much like what I was showing you before, is figure out how to engage different parts of the social network. There we go. Okay. Okay, so the screen share. Okay, so tipping points for change. We have the story of Black Lives Matter. We have the story of the growth of support for same-sex marriage, but we also have the story of Twitter. And it turns out these three stories are extremely similar. The way they operate in networks, the way the diffusion process worked. And what we see in all of them is that there's this beginning slow growth curve. Then there's this sort of elbow where it hits what we call the tipping point. It grows very, very fast, and then it slows off at the end. And this sort of S-shaped growth curve is something we see in every kind of change process, within organizations, across organizations, with social movements, with all the technology adoption. It's the same in every case. And what Rogers had said was, look, what's going on here is that during this slow growth period, really it's just that you have early adopters, people who are eager to adopt. Then what you do is you get the regular adopters, and that's a lot of people. So that's when it gets really, accelerated. And then you have the laggers, everyone else who's kind of reluctant to adopt, and they adopt at the end. So this is a very compelling story because it kind of assigns types of people to this massive, change dynamic. It's completely wrong. And more importantly, there's no empirical data to support it. There's no study that's actually gone through a diffusion curve and identified who the adopters were at each stage. This is just kind of an anecdotal description of a diffusion curve based on a kind of casual psychology of different types of people. It's compelling because it's intuitive, but it's wrong, right? What's really going on here is this slow growth part is a different part of the social network. It's the structured periphery, which is what I was showing you. It takes hold in the outer part of the network and doesn't just jump across the center. It kind of cascades slowly around the edge, building a critical mass. And this is key because the structured periphery and that sort of way of looking at networks actually is our key to understanding critical mass and tipping points. Because when the structured periphery gets saturated, that's when you hit a tipping point. And then that's when you go across the center of the network. This is when influencers get involved. This is like you basically built enough of a critical mass that now you see spreading. And this is one of the reasons why we make the mistake where we say, oh, look, we see an influencer, and then very quickly after that, everyone's adopted. Well, you've sort of started looking at it late in the diffusion process, because the question is, how does it grow to be so successful that the influencer actually takes notice, that the influencer feels comfortable adopting it? And this is true for every technology. And in the book, I have the story of Twitter, which is also exactly like this, where Twitter was like for years, just growing until it started reaching this sort of exponential, hyper-exponential growth. And it was at that point that like Oprah adopted. But she adopted when the technology had already exploded. It was in its fastest part of its growth curve. And then after she adopted, it actually slowed down because that was sort of the network process taking its sort of path to completion. And so if you look at it in this way, this is the figure I showed you before. What you're seeing here with this cascading around the edge is that kind of shallow growth part before you reach a critical mass. This is the structured periphery of wide bridges. And again, remember, it doesn't just jump to the center. You need to reach a critical mass before that happens. Once you reach a critical mass, this is where you see it starts to speed up and go right through the center of the network. And this is the sort of elbow or the tipping point, and then ultimately reaches the unstructured periphery. This is true for everything. And in the book, I talk about this, for solar panels, for bias in medicine, for political polarization, for the Me Too movement, for vaccination, and so forth. And so it becomes kind of a general story of understanding how networks operate in a way that the Everett Rogers story kind of overlooks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I have one more question for you. How do you recognize the place in the organization where the idea or norm, etc., shall be injected? I mean, how do you?
Yeah, no, I get it.
There is a second part. There is a second part. I mean, how do you recognize the starting point of the spreading to reach the maximum speed?
Yeah, no, I understand. So we just published a paper in Nature in July that answers that exact question. And also that paper was covered in Fast Company. So there's a bunch of news articles about it. Basically, we developed a mathematical formula where we can look at a network within an organization or within even an industry and pinpoint the exact little neighborhood of like 5 or 6 people that if you're able to activate them, it will effectively change the norms in the entire population. And so it's a group in the periphery, but it's a very specially located group. And what you're looking for really is wide bridges. You're looking for all the wide bridges across the organization. And there's a place in every organization, you can always find it. There's a place where the wide bridges intersect. Now, what's so interesting about this, and I talk about this towards the end of the book, is what's interesting about it is that there's no one person that's special in that particular group. It's not as if they're more highly connected or they are more charismatic or anything like that. The individual people in that group are like normal folks. What makes them special is that their group is located at the intersection of more wide bridges than any other group in the entire organization. And so you basically do this mapping technique where you map all the wide bridges and it just reveals this spot. And once you start with that spot, then it triggers change, in this way that I just described throughout the organization, ultimately hits a critical mass. So we ran this on a series of empirical studies. I think we did 72 different empirical networks, and then we compared it to data from historical studies of program management in India. And the data are really striking because every single empirical network you look at, you can always identify that specific spot and show that specific spot is more effective than any other location. And we compared it to all the traditional measures. So classic measures of centrality, degree of centrality, eigenvector centrality, betweenness centrality, they couldn't even compare. This measure is just like head and shoulders above in terms of being able to initiate these kinds of change processes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for answering those. This is what we have time for right now. But before we let you go, I would like to give you our present for you. And we will send this to you, and I hope you like it.
Thank you.
thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for this very, very educational talk. I'll definitely have to watch it all over again. And with that said, thank you so much for joining the Stretch Conference.